In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Welcome to We Make the City Reset, the From Now On series, and a very warm welcome from not only Amsterdam, but also Zurich, where Alfredo Brillenburg is joining us later in this program. We are talking about how all the world and how it has been changed, how our values have been turned upside down in the last months, and how exactly this gives us also opportunities to find new ways, to explore new methods, to kind of rethink the world and all its values in it. So this summer, every Thursday at 8:30 p.m., we will showcase the perspectives of a variety of thought leaders who will reflect on this present-day situation. What transformations will be left within the aftermath? From now on, today features Charlie Koolhaas, who invited Alfredo Brillenburg. Earlier guest, who also finished the quote from now on, said, for example, from now on, we will value public space differently in terms of freedom and responsibility. This was Liongo Juliana, an architect. And Kees Klomp, a researcher and advisor, said, from now on, we will stop mixing up wealth and well-being. And Annemiek van Boeien said, let's explore our visible cities. And Alfredo also featured in that one. Charlie says, from now on, all predictions are obsolete. Charlie Koolhaas is a socialist, an artist, a photographer, a teacher, and a writer. She grew up in London, graduated in New York in sociology, and then started a career in photography and in magazine and in writing. Then she received an MA in interactive media from Gold State University, and today she is here because of her recently published book, City Lust, which was published in February 2020. And it was published right before the whole world turned upside down. So there is a very interesting occasion to not only reflect all the richness of the content inside, but also on how perspectives can change in a very, very short period of time. So let me introduce to you now Charlie Koolhaas. Please come to the stage. Hi.
Thank you.
A very good evening to you. Very happy to have you here on the show. Usually you would receive a very warm welcome now from the audience with applause and everything. But today it will be just us and the cameras and all the Pakhuis team and the Arkham team. You will make a presentation of your book City Lust within a few minutes. But let's start first with talking a bit more about your quote, which says, from now on, all predictions will be obsolete. We will be talking about why they're obsolete later, but I thought maybe you can reflect a bit more on the word predictions. What kind of predictions are you referring to specifically?
Well, I think this statement refers to a lot of different scales. So I know that in my personal life and everyone's personal life, we kind of have this sense since the corona outbreak that we have no idea what's going to happen. So if you ask people when their projects will happen or where they'll be in a few weeks, everyone says we have no idea. But I think it's also, if you look at these predictions that have happened in the news at the moment, so predictions about the corona virus itself, you know, there seems to be just a huge amount of different scientific perspectives and predictions that say wildly different things, even though they are based supposedly on facts. So there's this kind of confusion about facts and therefore, of course, we see that in this obsession with news and fake news, you know, is this questioning of the facts and therefore the questionings of the legitimacy of predictions. And I think also you can see it in the election, the upcoming elections, is that, you know, we saw in 2016 with Trump's election that polls no longer mean anything, that if you ask people what they're going to do, what they say is very different from what they will actually, how they will actually act. So I think there's this kind of or global warming even, which is a completely different issue now than it was before the corona outbreak. So we've seen that, you know, there's been a massive change in the environment in only 6 months, and we have no idea what the long-term impact will be on the environment of our changed systems now.
In your book, as you mention how concepts like facts and fictions have changed, which in the realm of truth and non-truth. But within the context of your work, fact and fiction also kind of interfere, right? You use facts, or kind of a factional way of presenting the world or the city scenes that you that you're in, or that you present to us, and at the same time you write your stories and your personal experiences. How, for you, in the book, are fact and fiction important?
Well, I mean, I'm a photographer, and photography has always claimed to record some sort of truth, and yet that claim has been taken down in the last decades, and so you can no longer, you know, can you really be a documentary photographer now that we know that our images are always kind of guided by our perspectives and through our perspectives, and almost every record has this kind of understanding of subjectivity, and therefore within that the questioning of the possibility of objectivity altogether. So we know now that from every time we look at something, we look at it through our culturally relative perspective, and so I guess in a sense all recording is a fictional, or at least from a perspective. And therefore, we can say, can we even be objective anymore?
Thank you very much about this introduction and about this answer, which is actually an introduction to the presentation that you'll be giving now. I will give the floor to you, and we'll talk later after your presentation on City Lust. Thank you very much.
Okay. The story of City Lust starts in London, where I was born. You could say that my upbringing embodied the ideals of liberal multiculturalism. At that time, London was Europe's most multicultural city and at its socialist peak. And though it had been the center of Europe's most powerful colonial empire, this had created inherent conflict in English society between its drive towards idealistic egalitarianism, while its class system had been carefully maintained. I became interested in photographing the remains of London's experiment with socialism, as it was being dismantled by the market economy that has come to reign, which seemed to reinstall the power structures of previous elites, or at least eliminate any alternatives. We have called this, on a city scale, gentrification, which appears to be one of the fundamental mechanisms and effects of the global market economy. And in City Lust, I suggest that the art world has had an instrumental role in this process. Photography is a silent art, and yet the sounds and music of a place greatly determines and reveals its identity or identities, which is why I try to record music culture. I started my life in Camden in North London in the late 70s, which was the birthplace of punk. Punk had been born out of white working-class English people appropriating the Caribbean culture of the newly arrived immigrants into London. As I became a teenager, hip-hop was invented, and then as a result of the techniques of sampling that it inspired came rave, with which came a myriad of electronic musical genres that spread DJ culture across the globe. These musical forms were the products of the tensions and cultural hybridizations that the urban conditions of the 70s and 80s inspired. A universal urban culture had been born. or what we now refer to as street culture. And as culture became increasingly digitized, we were freed from our locations and offered the possibility of extending our communities across the globe. This urban culture became global culture, and it spoke of universal experiences, shared references and tastes. City Lust is an investigation into what global culture actually is and what it potentially means. I do so because through it, we see what we have in common, but also it reveals our differences. It tells us what exists within particular ideologies and what exists outside of political ideology altogether. One of the cultural phenomena that has been synonymous with global culture is hip-hop music, which was played and made in every city that I have visited, in almost every part of the world. Early rap, starting in the 1980s, launched calls to revolution disguised as dance music. One of its primary topics was police brutality. By exposing Western hypocrisies to the world, hip-hop offered empowerment to the marginalized around the globe, who in their turn were developing the genre with increasingly sophisticated appropriations. As it evolved, hip-hop has both illuminated the injustices of the capitalist model and promoted a brutal capitalist ideology. And yet, although hip-hop music spread awareness of police brutality to its millions of fans for decades already, we now see that the issues it voiced are as present and pressing today. And although the aesthetics of hip-hop culture dominates fashion and popular culture, somehow it has not done much, or rather enough, to empower the group who invented it. Therefore, the influence of hip-hop, combined with the continued marginalization of African-American people, provides us a broader insight into the nature of global culture. Not only does it show how global capitalism manages to co-opt its own critique and sell it back to us, but also that there is increasingly a difference between influence, which is connected to fame and visibility, and power, which is connected to wealth and anonymity. In 2005, I moved to Guangzhou in China, initially to be part of an exhibition, though I stayed for 6 years to record the moment in time when China swung open its doors to the global market and foreigners were welcomed in. Guangzhou, formerly Canton, is one of the oldest cities in existence. It is a story of humankind's global expansion in a single city. It is also the beating heart of China's black market. The city's illegal population is estimated at up to 6 million people. It has always existed on the periphery of government control. Informal conditions, such as the urban villages, which were once farms that have been engulfed by the city as they developed, are some of the few parcels of land owned by individuals rather than the state. Guangzhou is teeming with traders from across the globe. 1 million alone visit the 2-week-long trade fair every year, making an average of $12 billion worth of deals in the first week alone. Because of these visitors, there are a myriad recreation of their different global cultures, all relegated to their own segregated subsection of the city. There is a substantial African population, though exact figures as to how many populate the city are hard to find. By 2008, however, it was reported that the number of African residents was increasing by 30 to 40% annually, making Guangzhou the largest African community in Asia. The African traders are some of the most integrated and long-term foreigners in the city and have established so many businesses catering to their needs that there is even an African part of the city called Chocolate City. Rather than being propelled towards uniformity, we are being provided with new forms of authenticity. Different parts of the world become fused together wherever migrants recreate their home culture on alien territory. Cities are no longer separate places. Instead, they contain portals to each other, each with their own unique cross-cultural section of the world, like collages of other places, oddly reenacted or remixed. These unique cross-cultural pollinations, appropriations, and hybrids express a contemporary inventiveness that is unconnected to concepts of authorship or even originality. It is the copy and paste mechanism as design, the advancement of civilization as a sequence of sampling, similar to how music is produced. These cultural fusions are the most compelling form of now. It was only when I visited Lagos in Nigeria when I understood where the Chinese products that I had seen being produced had landed, and also the significance of Chinese production as a means of undoing the legacy of European colonialism. But my familiarity with the place was not only guided my experience with Nigerians in China, who dominate the African community there because Lagos is Africa's chief port. It was also because much of the architecture looked similar to the socialist brutalism that I'd photographed in London. Buildings that had been constructed after independence. They had a similar aesthetic that seemed to be indicative of the gesture towards egalitarianism of the 60s and 70s that had swept through the globe before the supposed end of history when the market economy had fully come to reign. My book is named after City Lust, a perfume that I found in Dubai, a Chinese-made rip-off of Sex in the City perfume. Sold in Dubai, one of the world's biggest ports and a major import and export hub, City Lust was meant for export to Africa and the Middle East. To me, it symbolized the way in which Western values are exported, appropriated, and reimagined in other parts of the world. In Dubai, where at that time foreigners made up nearly 95% of the population, I again found these recreations of alien cultures existing as separate enclaves. This was a mode of togetherness and form of tolerance that was different from the idealistic multiculturalism that I had grown up with in London. This was more pragmatic, based purely on economic need rather than understanding or assimilation. It allowed people to live together, but maintain their separateness and even their ideological differences. I moved to Houston, Texas in 2009. Being back in the Western world, I was confronted with the prejudices and the stereotypes about the non-Western countries that I'd been to. These were sometimes at odds with the new types of freedom and enthusiasm for foreign influence and globalization that I had experienced in places like Dubai and Guangzhou. Though I had certainly also seen and recorded the exploitation of the laborers in Dubai, for instance, or the impoverished Chinese migrants, I had discovered that openness and repression can exist concurrently, and there never is one thing happening at once, nor can any country's identity or culture be neatly or easily defined. I also saw how entrenched our Western feeling of superiority are that assert that we in the West are the most developed, the most modern, and the most free. But the tentativeness of this notion was exposed by an encounter with police on the outskirts of Houston, which made me see firsthand for the first time in all my travels the terrifying power of the state apparatus, though ironically I was in the country of the free. It brought home the messages that hip-hop music had warned me about for decades, showing the role of the police in the maintenance of entrenched racial and economic hierarchies. It took me 10 years to make this book, starting in 2008, when the first economic global recession hit. This coincided with Obama's election and the supposed post-racial world, which we now know never materialized. In 2008, these photographs show globalization at its peak. But it was difficult to finish the book because in the decade after 2008, the meanings of the photographs continued to change. The story kept writing and rewriting itself as globalization seemed to go into reverse, and the apparently linear process of unification turned out to not be linear at all. Meanwhile, the world has U-turned towards isolationism. Now we see two things happening at once. We are united as the market economy ties us together. At the same time, our differences are becoming more pronounced as we become increasingly divided ideologically and politically. This is togetherness without consensus. And as the pretense of moral obligations become erased from our political agendas, it seems like it is the forces of capital alone that are guiding our global alliances. I have captioned my photographs with my personal story that describes my experiences of what I've seen. This seemed necessary to be honest about my positioning and the role of my own identity in my experience of the world. At a moment when the possibility of neutrality is in question, now that we have become aware of the cultural biases inherent in the act of recording, as I photographed this world, I had my own identity reflected back at me, aware that to record the world would reveal as much about me and what it meant to be female, white, and European as it would about that world. City Lust is a record of the globalization of our cultures and economies over the last 2 decades, as it impacts the daily lives of these 5 linked cities. That reveals dramatically shifting racial and political dynamics. My book was released in February of 2020, just before the current interlocking avalanche of crises, corona, police brutality, economic war between the US and China, for all of which it now appears to provide a context.
Charlie, that's a very impressive kind of attempt, I'd say, to kind of bring all these cities together and also link them to your own history, your own youth, your own upbringing, your own working, let's say, history. I was wondering, because this is huge book with all this pile of photographs, and it shows this will to understand, to unite, to kind of celebrate diversity. Yet the book starts with how your own youth was maybe also like this melting pot of all these different cultures and all these different friends from all these different fields within the neighborhood where you grew up and the school you went to. Is it something that you need to learn, like you did, to have this kind of sixth sense or a specific sensitive eye to see this urban culture, do you think? Is it something that you grew very sensitive to?
Well, I think I was the child of immigrants, Dutch immigrants, and a lot of my friends were also second-generation immigrants. And I think just by virtue of that experience, I was already felt on the outside, you know, so there was a certain objectivity. I even spoke Dutch for the first time. So I remember the first time my first language, so when I first went to school, I remember people speaking in a sort of a language I didn't understand. So there was this already a distance, and maybe you automatically, as an outsider, become an observer or are forced into position of that observer. So I certainly think that that made a difference. And at the same time, I was subsumed into this very English class system, you know? So if 2 things happened at once, that there was, of course, this kind of multicultural, it was a melting pot, and at the same time, it was extremely stratified. And maybe because it was also this English class system that I, again, didn't particularly connect to or understand, or maybe didn't fit all the way into. Again, I had that objectivity where I could see this sort of role of, and these economic divides.
So it's also the discrepancy between informal structures and very formal structures that are laying on top of those.
Yeah, and also historical structures and these kind of new possibilities, which is this new possibility which we have of a kind of new unity and this possibility of, you know, I mean, of a post-racial, post-national world. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you know, we understand that history has really embedded certain racial hierarchies and economic hierarchies, and and patterns that are much harder to disconnect from, and we really have to unravel, and they can't be unraveled with just purely idealism or with a shift in attitude or even getting to know each other.
But also in your book, you describe how you engaged with the cities that are part of your book, the 5 cities, which are, after all, a selection of many more cities that you have been to. Why did you decide on these 5 cities in what you're describing now in history and in context? And why are these 5 for you the most prominent and most important to reveal?
Well, for me, firstly, they were the cities that I was most intimately familiar with. So it were the cities in which I actually lived, other than Nigeria, but which I had lived and worked in. And so they were the ones that I had the most kind of coherent records of. But, and therefore also the experience, so I felt that I was able to talk about what lived life in those cities was about, you know. And again, at the same time, I was a stranger or an outsider in all of those cities. So I thought that it could be these 2 experiences. But also, it was really, I chose cities on different continents so that these 5 cities could really provide a kind of cross-section of the world. And also, they were these major kind of hubs on these different continents. So they were the financial hubs. And so suddenly, when I started to get to know these cities, I started to see them, how they were connected. So when I went to Guangzhou, I saw, of course, this connection of kind of the British, you know, colonialism and the British influence in that area, because it's so connected to Hong Kong. And also there was a huge Nigerian community. So when I went to Lagos, I met a lot of people who lived in Guangzhou. So, and then when I went to Dubai again, I saw that that was another place where the products came from China and were spread through Africa. So slowly, as I became more and more familiar with the cities, I started to see that through them, this global market economy was enabled and existed, and yet I was witnessing the super mundane flow of products, and in this mundane flow and in these kind of silly details, I could see the kind of bigger political kind of system. And and we were talking a lot about the global market economy and globalization. We talk about it in these incredibly broad terms, and so I wanted to bring that discussion down to the very small mundane details and the lives of, you know, traders who essentially mediate this global market economy.
I was fascinated about how you are able to grasp in your images exactly those superstructures like financial markets and democratic systems or non-democratic systems, and at the same time the very informal and much more, let's say, sensitive kind of structures that are underneath it. Also, you mentioned in your presentation just now how you couldn't, or you became more and more aware of the fact that you were a photographer and also a woman, which of course in this time span of 10 years also became a much more prominent theme in debates and in urban cultures. Could you give us a very specific example of when, at what moment you felt, for example, this white Western female photographer being at work in a context that made that very, very evident?
Well, of course, you know, the people's fear of the camera immediately, the minute you start photographing. I always say photography is like, it's like being comparable to being a traffic warden, you know. It's the thing that people kind of attack you for and tell you what not to do. And that's because there is this, you know, fear of it, and maybe a feeling, a kind of it there being an exploitative element. And this has been well considered, and I've considered it, and I've read about it, and I've thought about it a lot. You know, and at the same time, I do it because I feel that there is this sort of value in creating records of people and conditions that aren't exposed and aren't known about, and maybe contradict, you know, certain prejudices and stereotypes that we have. So it's at once, you know, it's a very complicated profession, and that's what makes it interesting. And at the same time, in the last 10 years, this whole notion of the exploitation of photography has kind of also become redundant. Now, the fact that everyone has a camera phone and everyone's taking selfies and we're having our photo or our image, we've kind of lost total control of our image also with the mass surveillance, you know? So at the same time, the discussion has been annihilated by the surveillance and people's you know, the fact that everyone has become a photographer, or at least is photographing. And at the same time, the camera phone for me is an incredibly radical, probably the most radical invention. And you see that with the protests, and you see that how this, you know, how the Black Lives Matter movement to now, and these protests have been inspired by the pictures, the images taken on picture phones, you know, so it's been a tool of empowerment. And I see that very much with the way that, what is the role of the photographer now that everyone has the power to photograph themselves and create their own representations, you know, I think is interesting.
Yeah. To illustrate this unifying and also polarizing effect with the camera, you can also you also mentioned music, hip-hop music specifically, which is both globally and very specific and very individual as a means of expression. You brought a short clip to illustrate that. Could you give a short explanation of why you wanted to show this specific clip, and then I'll start introducing Alfredo and bring him into the conversation as well.
All right, so this clip is basically a hip-hop video made by KRS-One, who is one of the very influential rappers, early rappers. And he has made a video with other rappers from all across the world. So it shows how this one art form has kind of taken root and become kind of totally global. And at the same time, the messages of it are a very radical one, you know, and it's really about kind of voicing the empowering marginalized groups. And it's also very explicitly about unity and unifying the world. So I think it kind of embodies the power of
and very
culture,
political as well.
Yeah.
Let's have a look.
Uloge shvati, otac i mati, za tebe sam bro. Puno levati vole srati, al ne jebem to kroz zvučne kanale. Ulazim u glave za mušterije stalne i FM će me rane. Slušam vale, pali mikrofone sale. Raja zname, fake internacionale.
Di kalangan karanganku kalamkan keluaran kedalamanku dalamkan pengamalan. Pengalaman bukan semalaman, meramalkan ramalan peramalan lengkap 8. Rangkap 7 langkah ke angkasa ku angkatkan, keangkatan tingkatkan, ketangkasan raja mangkat. Tak bertanjak, lancang dipantang, daulat tak mudah kau tangkap. What?
Hello hello fellas की हाल है, मैं हाँ ADX 922 भी मेरे नाल है. मेरा देश इंडिया नु करन पेश, global hip hop दी रेस में चले आ. चमे मैं poet from the streets, मेरी कुंडली च लिखे आ. Music मेरा लोकल गोल ले आउंदा, इंसान दी बनाई होई दूरियां मिटाउंदा. Worldwide, everybody put your hands in the air. La 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 la.
Yeah, fantastic to see how all these different countries also unify in the same beat. Yeah. Alfredo, probably you have visited all these countries and all these cities that we have just been seeing. I would very much like to introduce you to the audience. You received an architect's degree in 1986 from Columbia University, and then in 1992 from the University of Venezuela. And you founded Urban Think Tank in 1998 with Hubert Klumpner. And I think that maybe we can call you the expert on urban informality, in structures, in networks, in buildings. You co-curated the Shenzhen Biennale in 2015, which was titled Reliving the City, which is basically what we are trying to do every day, again and again. So, and you worked with Charlie in various cities and projects. And in October, you will be doing teaching sessions at the Independent School for the City in Rotterdam together. So you have a very, very close connection to the topics that we are discussing today. We selected a very small piece of a movie that you made in 2013, which is called Gran Horizonte, Around the Day in 80 Worlds, which is maybe a good illustration of how you view the city and how it is a global and also a local thing. And then we'll get back to you. So, Alfredo, we thought it could be a good illustration of all the types and worlds and city environment that you've been working in. Could you maybe do a brief introduction to what we just saw and how this is important to your work?
Sure. So, Urban Think Tank's always been kind of a research firm, always very closely related to university teaching and the practice. So we try and look at the city and try and discover ways in which people, the actors on the ground, are making city and try and transform them into some kind of a toolkit, or try and transform it into some kind of understandable pattern that we can then appropriate to make better design. So, I mean, I know you've been talking about the future, and I think the future's arrived because you can't think about the future without thinking about present day. So I think that's what much like Charlie with her photographs going around the world, Gran Horizonte is the grand horizon. It's looking at globalization. Yes, I mean, it's a bad word. It's been equated with, you know, something terrible, which is capitalism, globalization, but actually, global is interesting because it's hybrid. It makes a cultural mix that is actually helping us to maybe practice signifying what we see. So in this time dominated by COVID and the pandemic and Black Lives Matter and French Yellow Vests, I'm very interested to understand those who endure distress, who are living in precarious situations, who are actually only resource is informality. So after globalization, I'd say informality is the second biggest theme in our 21st century.
Looking at Charlie's work and how she proceeds and tries to get a grip of the city, almost like dissecting the city and the different cities where she went to, as a means to understand and to illustrate. I thought that I found it interesting that although it's completely different, you try and do the same thing. You already mentioned the toolbox. Could you explain a bit more about your working method and how you see that reflected into Charlie's way of working?
Sure. I mean, I'm trying to think about the future of the city. If you're thinking about the future, it's impossible to not write about the present, right? So we're in a moment of incredible, harsh social and political change, and I guess the thinking about the future is very slippery. And the only way I can get a grasp on thinking about the future is thinking about what I see happening right now. So in Charlie's photo, and I've been on many of those trips with her, you see the global trader, if you want. In Charlie's own words, it's kind of turning the brim on the globe. And if you take the city of Guangzhou, in Pearl River Delta, it's an industrial corridor. It's been booming for years now. It has about $2 billion of foreign investment flowing in on a monthly basis. So we're talking about all exports from China used to originate mostly from Guangzhou. It was incredibly well located on the Pearl River, and Charlie's documented that together with me, and she's done that many times. She took me through Guangzhou. And one of the interesting things was precisely these different neighborhoods, the clusters of which are in her book, the Nigerians in Guangzhou. That was super interesting to see, and to see how the global system, the reality of the system, and all of these globetrotters or traders, if you want, get worked on and moved basically in the most down and dirty ways. And I think what I'm trying to say is that globalized capital markets also give us mobility when we could move, right? We can't move now. We can talk about that later. And they demand from us to accept differences. The rules of the games obviously have turned, and yesterday's payoff is today's nomadic surviving. So it's a very interesting moment in time.
And so what you share is your, the kind of a way to look deeper into the role of global markets, of finance, of democracy, and how they shape both the informal and the formal city. You already mentioned you need to be there, you need to go there to find and experience and to do research, to get the data, to get a grasp of this reality that is on different levels, present on different levels. And you also said we can't move there now. How does this affect the way you work?
Well, I'm fascinated now because Charlie and I have talked about it, where we are in such a moment, the COVID moment, which everything is working informally. So university structures have broken down, webinars are appearing, thousands per day. In other words, everyone now can teach, everyone can upload something, everyone can connect, and it's quite interesting, the diversity of information, all happening from your own home. So you don't even have to be in the city anymore to be urban. Urban in the sense of connecting with people, connecting with ideas, living a kind of urban life or urban imaginary. And I think that's what Charlie tries to do in her photographs, by she juxtaposes very intentionally, butting one photo from against another, and she demonstrates this very strange thing, as if all those cities were interconnected somehow into one city or one horizon of urbanization. We've been so concerned, and you see it with Black Lives Matter, with historical injustices of 1 or 2 generations back, 100 years back. Which war killed who's displaced, what injustices have been done upon, Black African Americans, or to, women in general. But I think this last 6 months really have made me think about social relationships and really have made me think about the consumption of gossip, of mass media. And I think we're all dealing with this very strange moment in which everything that we understood, or all the hierarchies that we understood have kind of erased, and in this kind of pivotal moment where the microeconomic system is kind of, blasting and I want to look at with enthusiasm at the future. And so I do think about this kind of transnational version of living that would be spiritual and ethical. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very concerned on how we can create cities. How can we create countries? How can we make nations come together in some kind of seamless urban planet, if you want.
Specifically, because what you're talking about is the opportunities these times offer to reunite, to strengthen positions, to establish connectivities, and at the same time, and this is the next movie that we will be showing, that Charlie brought to share with us, is how specifically the political structures and the global structures are actually trying to get a firmer grip on these informal systems. So let's first have a look, and then maybe Charlie, you can comment on that first.
City leaders in southern China are denying allegations of coronavirus racism, insisting that foreigners are not being discriminated against. Africans living in Guangzhou say that they're being kicked out of their homes and face harassment as health workers step up testing for imported infections. The African Union, Nigeria and Ghana are calling on the Chinese government to address concerns. Professor Keith Richberg is the director of the Journalism and Media Studies Centre at the University of Hong Kong. He says there has been discrimination against Africans living in China for some time now.
Ever since Xi Jinping announced that the virus was essentially contained in China and that they could start reopening businesses and reopening factories, the numbers have been going up, but they've been blaming all of those new numbers, those new cases and the new deaths in China on what they call imported cases, meaning that they've contained it in China, but people coming back into the country are bringing it along. It smacks a bit of xenophobia to me, because number one, most of these so-called imported cases are Chinese nationals who left at Chinese New Year and are just now returning, or returning from schools abroad, etc. So these aren't foreigners, these are Chinese who are bringing in with the virus. And secondly, they've been given really no statistics to prove that the real numbers of people coming in with the virus are actually foreigners at all. But that's kind of the narrative or the storyline that they'd like to say, is that all of these new cases are all from foreigners. They've even restricted foreign diplomats from coming back into Beijing, for example. China has always had this kind of complex relationship with Africa, whereas officially, they see the African countries as brothers. Lately, China has put a lot of development money into Africa. They built the African Union headquarters. They built the railroad from Nairobi to Mombasa. But and as a consequence of these tens of thousands or millions of Chinese living in Africa, you also have a lot of African traders, African students who have gone over to China. And so officially, on an official level, there's this kind of feeling of fraternity. On the ground level, people to people, the Chinese simply don't like them very much. They're basically there's a lot of racism. I've been to Guangzhou. I've been to that area that they call Little Africa, or more derogatorily, they call it the Chocolate City. The Africans tell me they feel discriminated against by the Chinese.
And there it stops. So here we see a video of how Africans are being evicted from their homes in China. At the same time, of course, there are other eruptions of racism against Chinese. And in India, you can see the same. You can see the slums in Brazil, where things like this happen. Mm. What exactly is it? What is happening here when you look at this movie?
Well, what's happening is incredibly sad, because the Africanization of Guangzhou was indicative of a trend of this sort of, which was a very hopeful new relationship between China and Africa that would allow both China and Africa to cut out kind of the European and the Western middlemen that had guided most business previously. but also it was a reinstalling of old relationships that existed before European colonialism, and that European colonialism in fact severed, you know. So it was a new incarnation of an old relationship, and that was a lot of promise that now seems to be again under threat. But what we didn't show was another clip, which was also showing about the kind of massive racism across the globe against Chinese people living outside of China, also as COVID, as a result of COVID. So this doesn't point fingers towards the Chinese racism, but it points fingers towards the way in which racism has been mobilized on a totally global scale as a result of COVID, and COVID is just showing us how quickly racism can be mobilized and divisions can be reinstalled, and to a certain extent how fragile this kind of global unity that we had truly is. But for me, it was very sad to see this, but it means a lot for my book and for my photographs, because it shows that the conditions that I photographed just 10 years ago, the photographs, you know, the book was about this moment now, and yet this moment is completely past. So it's already a kind of history that doesn't exist anymore. And I see that, and I'm sure Alfredo has that also in his work, that a lot of the things that you recorded are now gone, you know, so the ideas, because of COVID. So for instance, my photographs of people living with animals in China, or even photographs of dirt or density or informal conditions, all of these things are being regulated and maybe eliminated, you know, like we no longer are allowed density. So it's a completely changed world. So it's, you know, so basically all of our recordings, which were about the present, are the recordings now of a kind of lost past.
What kind of recordings are you talking about apart from the photography?
No, yeah, I'm talking about the photography or the research or the story I tell. It's a completely different world now, because.
And then Alfredo, because how would you reflect that? We assume here that it's the same for you. That lots of the things you have recorded, that you have researched and investigated, are now gone. Do you agree with that? Is that how you feel it?
Well, I'm fascinated by this moment of kind of entropy. We saw the 90s booming, construction everywhere, China, etc. And now you see the world in a kind of entropy in this COVID moment where everything's kind of going backwards. And if we really were to appreciate life, we would feel some kind of spiritual satisfaction by even viewing these maybe uglier parts of reality of the city, as Charlie's saying, the informal. I mean, I would love to go to Rotterdam and see what was called, maybe Charlie correct me, the African market, the Rotterdam market that used to be there. What is it called there in Rotterdam, Charlie? That informal market?
I'm not sure actually. Is it the one? Yeah.
It was kind of a big open market that happened on the weekends, where everyone traded things in a very interesting, unique way. All of those things are getting lost, yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't in Rotterdam. It was probably in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, our formulas of beauty are eradicating all these uglier or more interesting parts, I feel, of life, attempting to wipe away, I guess, in some kind of form of nostalgia for unification or formalization. And if you look at China, Charlie, I'll just refer that for a second. With Charlie, we were in Guangzhou, and you see down the Pearl River, they're doing it up like the Seine in Paris. They're making beautiful balustrades along it and walkways and trees. But at the same time, it smells of toxins. And then, as Charlie once said to me, and you see once in a while a swollen dead pig float by. Now, I just want to put that really, on the table, but at the same time, and Charlie, correct me, there's some beauty in that animal floating down the river, because on the belly shine the bright lights on the bloated belly of the neon animations of the billboards flanking the river. So, and I think Charlie has captured that kind of contrast. And I thank her for that, because in a way, yeah, it's a great archive, or if you want so, a glowing art.
Well, I think it's interesting that, you know, we battled, there's this kind of new level of control and control of dirt, and to a certain extent, or what you said, this kind of nostalgia, this sort of a fight against ugliness, or, you know, but all of these things, all political arguments that we were engaged in and we could actually argue against, have been replaced by a kind of universal fight against bacteria. So it's so interesting that the political and all political arguments were basically annihilated by by bacteria and our fear of bacteria.
And through bacteria, it has reached all sorts of levels of control, not only in hygiene, but also in politics, or also in crowd control, or also in human rights. So what you see is that, as a kind of a closing thought for this session, as we are about to round up, within these times of control, of displacement, of anxiety, you can see how all sorts of informality and of structures are being affected and annihilated. Yeah. How will this affect the specific cities that you have described in your book?
Well, like I said, you know, there are these things like the urban villages and the informal conditions and the people living with animals, all of that will be probably radically changed, and yet we don't know for how long, and if this is a permanent change, and can you even change that? Or is this kind of human drive to take control and defy authority, is that more powerful? And you see that in the protests across the world, that in the end, you know, this kind of control, this new goal of control has actually been met by like widespread protest across the world. And so to a certain extent, human nature might defy this authoritarianism that is happening everywhere. But at the same time, I also think, just to end on a positive note, I think there is other, you know, it's a changing world. And with every change, we should never say something will be bad, something will be sad, something, because at the same time, new possibilities will emerge. And that's what me and Alfredo were talking about. Was that at the same time, for instance, the fact that now all of like the, you know, institutions have been disabled and there are new possibilities for inclusion. So, for instance, I talk, you know, there's new now people who aren't mobile can become included in teaching or in the art world, or it also allows no longer to be kind of our roles and our hierarchies and our positions and statuses to be determined by where we are. So it also frees us potentially from a lot of these hierarchies that have been so embedded for so long.
Yeah. Alfredo, Charlie's quote is, from now on, all predictions are obsolete. Do you agree with that? And what do you think will be most obsolete?
Well, I think what she means by it is that the future is unfolding before us as we talk. So it's all about human nature, and it's all about intention. So I think on a positive note, we have yet to see if human nature's intention is to allow for more freedom, for more possibilities. And I mean, Charlie knows that I'm saying it and rapping it all the time, but I believe informality is the new normality. So this doesn't catch me by surprise. I was just waiting for it. You know, we need more ethics, less aesthetics. We need new vocabulary. What is even normal? What is ever formal? The markets give us people the invisible backhand. Suburban sprawl, crawling to falling apart at the seams. It seems to me that the formal isn't what they told us it would be.
Thank you so much, Alfredo, for being part of this conversation. I have a slide in 40 seconds to close off, so thank you very much, Charlie, for being and explaining about the book and for the debate you two offered us. I'm happy also with your positive notes, which are, of course, also reflected in the title of your book, which is City Lost, and it also expresses a kind of belief in the strength of cities to always re-innovate, reinvent, and emerge, maybe, or be reliving. I would like to invite you all to come to have a look at the next session as well, which is with Matthijs Schouten, ecologist, geologist, and professor in nature and landscape conservation. And of course, also push the pay-as-you-like button, because all these programs are made for you for free, and we desperately need some support from you. Thank you very much, Alfredo, Charlie, and all the audience outside. Bye.